pleased to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Leah Steinberg and Dr. Jeff Myers. Dr. Steinberg is a palliative care physician at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. She currently teaches palliative care to all levels of learners and is involved in research in creating models for integrating palliative care into chronic disease management. Dr. Steinberg is also a member of the Advanced Care Planning Goals of Care and Healthcare Consent Clinician Advisory Team at Hospice Palliative Care Ontario. Dr. Jeff Myers has been a palliative medicine physician for the past 25 years and is currently medical director for Sinai Health's Ridgepoint Palliative Care Program. He's an associate professor at the University of Toronto, and where he has held the W. Gifford Jones Professor in Palliative Care for 9 years as head of the Faculty of Medicine's Division of Palliative Care. His academic focus is on improving the quality of advanced care planning and goals of care discussions for seriously ill people and their families. Welcome, Dr. Steinberg and Myers. I'll now turn off my video and turn the presentation over to our speakers.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here in the new way that here is. It's lovely to be presenting to all of you. I wish I could see you, and I know Jeff would say the same thing. So we're going to get right into it because we want to leave, we've got things we want to say, and we want to leave lots of time for questions. So I like to start this talk with this image because I think many people feel very nervous when we're going to begin talking about issues around advanced care planning, maybe things around the end of life. And to me, this dog expresses that kind of, I'm sort of curious, I want to know, and I'm maybe a little worried. So I'm going to reassure you all to take a leap of faith, and we're going to be good. So I'm just going to start by asking, you know, what when I tell people what I do, or when I begin these conversations, sometimes people often say, you know, but aren't people afraid to talk about this? Aren't they afraid of end of life and talking about this? And maybe it means it's going to happen sooner. And I have lots of responses, but this is my favorite one is, and it works better when there's a whole audience and we can all see. But I suspect that many people, when I do this in a large audience, almost everybody puts up their hand when I say, who's heard of the book and the story around Tuesdays with Morrie, which is written now 20 years ago by Mitch Albom, who's a journalist, who when he learned that his sociology professor had ALS, he visited him, I think for 16 visits through to the end of his life and wrote about it. And wrote about the lessons learned, etc. And it became a New York Times bestseller. And it was actually on the bestseller list for 205 weeks. It's one of the top selling memoirs of all time. And it actually sold over 14 million copies and has been translated into 41 languages. I don't know if you're aware, this is a fantastic book by Atul Gawande called Being Mortal that is also very popular. It helps people think about the supports and the issues that arise as people age and approach end of life. And Oliver Sacks, a well-known neurologist, on learning that he had terminal cancer, wrote a beautiful article. And the thing that I wanted to read is he says, it's up to me now to choose how to live. I feel intensely alive, and I want and hope that in the time that remains to deepen my friendships, to say farewell to those I love, to write more, to travel if I have the strength, to achieve new levels of understanding and insight. Again, this is Randy Pausch, who was a young communications, I'm going to get that wrong, professor at Carnegie Mellon, who was diagnosed very young with metastatic pancreatic cancer. And he was invited to give what they call at Carnegie Mellon the last lecture, which is generally for a retiring professor who sums up what they've learned. And Randy gave his last lecture, and it was turned into a beautiful book. It was again on the New York Times bestseller list. He even got a billboard. And the lecture, though, wasn't about dying. It was about the importance of overcoming obstacles, of enabling the dreams of others, of seizing every moment. It was a summation of everything Randy had come to believe. It was about living. Again, bestseller remained on the bestseller list for 112 weeks. So why do I spend time here? People actually, I think, are very interested in how to get prepared and how to think about their life, how to think about end of life. And that brings us to one of the ways in which we encourage people to get prepared and to start to think and to realize that it's actually something that can be very meaningful and much more about living than about dying. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Myers.
Thanks, Leah. Good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to be here with you. So I'll just ask Leah to advance the slides for me. And when we think about advanced care planning, next slide, please, Leah. There's some words that you might come across or that might be spoken about the topic and include things like living wills as a phrase, power of attorney, goals of care, an advanced care plan itself, and then an acronym that's often used in many different settings, provinces, and different countries around the world. Next slide, Leah. You also might think of advanced care planning as, to kind of summarize, as completing a form like this. And not to get into the details of this form, but what it's meant to reflect is decisions that people will potentially need to face in the future. And in the past, sort of 30 years ago, when advanced care planning was first initiated as a concept, the thought was that if we completed a form like this ahead of time, years in advance, that might actually give families and patients, people, information on how decisions could be made and what decisions people would want to have made for themselves in the future if they were in such a position to require some things like CPR, nutrition, hydration that's artificial, and et cetera. Next slide. The question is do these forms work? Next slide, please, Leah. And what we found in quite a number of years of research is that absolutely not. That even if you have clear decisions or clear thoughts about these kinds of treatments ahead of time, that actually expressing specific information about treatments is not effective. Next slide. And the question is why? Why is that the case? The reason is that people cannot make decisions in advance. You cannot, when a person doesn't have sort of a clinical context or a story as to what's actually happening at the time. Previous ideas or thoughts around treatments really can't be applied necessarily to that specific context in the future. Also for Ontario, we have things set up in our province in such a way that the legislation or the laws around decision-making, and the law specifically is called the Healthcare Consent Act, it makes it very clear that these kinds of documents, these kinds of advanced decisions are actually not legal. They shouldn't be available in Ontario, and really in large part, it's because they will not be applicable to illness situations that individuals will be facing at some point in the future. Next slide, please, Leah. So the question is then what actually is advanced care planning? What needs to happen during advanced care planning conversations? And there's two steps. And the first step that we'd invite you to consider is identify your substitute decision maker. So what do we mean by that? Next slide. So, if there comes a time in the future that a person is not able to make decisions for themselves, then a person that will need to make them on their behalf, need to make decisions on their behalf. And that person would be called a substitute decision maker. In Ontario, the way the Healthcare Consent Act has been, was scripted, and I think quite brilliantly, every person in Ontario automatically has a substitute decision maker by law. So everyone on this call, everyone that you know actually has already a substitute decision maker by default. And I'll show you, we'll talk about each of these three sections really quickly, but the green section I would focus your attention to begin with, because what this is a hierarchy of priority or authority for substitute decision makers. So what this means is that if we focus on the green, if you have a spouse or a partner, by definition, that person is your substitute decision maker in Ontario by default. If you don't have a spouse or a partner, then go down the list. It would be your parents or your children that would be automatic substitute decision makers. And really quickly, what that means is if you have one parent and two children alive at the moment, all three of them actually are joint substitute decision makers for you if you were to lose the capacity to make decisions. And then it goes down the list. If you don't have parents or children, if you don't have a parent, if you're adopted and you don't have a parent with the right of access only, if you don't have siblings, or if you don't have any other relatives, then you don't have anyone in the green section that would be your automatic substitute decision maker. And then we would default to the blue section, which is the public guardian and trustee. So for any person who doesn't have anyone in the green, then there is the blue, the public guardian and trustee, who would act to substitute decision make on your behalf if you did not have the capacity. Now, what the yellow signifies, the yellow group, the three layers there, these are legally appointed substitute decision makers. And I'll focus your attention on the attorney for personal care. If, let's say, for example, you do have a spouse or partner, or you do have children, but your sister or your brother is actually the person who would be ideal for you to make decisions on your behalf, you could then appoint that person using an attorney for personal care, or the other language that's used is power of attorney. You can make that person your substitute decision maker, which would then trump or be the priority person in the future if you needed to have decisions made. So although we have a default substitute decision maker, each of us you have lots of decisions on how that looks, and happy to answer more questions when we get to the question period about that. Thanks, Leah. The next step then is to prepare your substitute decision maker. Once you identify who this person is, then we need to prepare that person. How do we do that? Next slide, please. Thanks, Leah. So the way that you prepare them is two major steps and then reviewing over time. The first step, reflection, the second step, conversation, and then reviewing over time. So what do we mean by reflection? It really is thinking about your values, right? Instead of thinking about what you would want or not want to have happen to you, or what treatments you would want or not want, it's what's important and what's helpful information for substitute decision makers is information about your values. What's important to you, what makes life worth living, what kind of living you would accept, what you wouldn't accept, what you would trade, what does suffering mean to you, and what makes it good to be alive. Next slide, please. It is not an epiphany. It is not about arriving at these questions quickly. It really is a thoughtful process over time that you really consider each of these questions. And most importantly, it's not about treatments. Next slide, please. So then the next step would be conversation. Next slide. Conversation with your substitute decision maker and other family members, if you wish, about these reflections that you've had. Next slide. So to try and make this a little bit easier and make this a bit more concrete, we've encouraged you to think about asking yourself 4 questions. The first one is, what do I value most in terms of my mental and physical health? For example, is it being able to live independently, recognize folks, communicate with loved ones, or do I value most living as long as possible? The next question that we'd encourage you to think about is, what would make prolonging life unacceptable to you? For example, not being able to communicate with my loved ones, being kept alive on machines, not having control of my bodily functions. The next question that we'd encourage you to think about is, when I think about dying, is there anything I worry about happening to me? For example, struggling to breathe, being in pain, being alone, losing my dignity, and what dignity actually looks like for you, what undignified looks like for you. And the last question that we'd encourage you to think about is, if I were nearing death, what would make it peaceful for me? Having my family and friends nearby, dying at home. Where is your home? Dying somewhere other than home. Having spiritual rituals performed, and not being a burden to my family. Next slide. So the next step after that would then to have that conversation with your substitute decision maker and talk to them about your values, how you answered the questions. An important point, you can write down your thoughts, and it can be very helpful to do that. And in the future, your substitute decision maker can use what's written down or use their memory of conversations to guide decision making. But what's really important to note is that what's written down cannot be used to actually make a decision. It cannot, if you happen to write down on a piece of paper, I do not want to be put on machines. Doctors cannot use that information because every treatment decision requires consent from a capable person, be it from you or your substitute decision maker. So just be mindful that what you write down is really intended to help guide your SDM. This is not a one-time conversation, folks. It's something very iterative. It happens over time. We change. Our ability as humans to adapt is profound. And so the things that today we might think we wouldn't tolerate, we might consider quite easily that we would tolerate them 5 years from now. So refreshing these reflections and conversations is incredibly important over time. And I think with that, I'll turn it back to Leah.
Thanks, Jeff. So I wanted to give you guys an example of how this can work. I was asked once by a young woman about her grandmother, and the woman, there's something a little bit wonky with this slide. Hang on a second. There we go. The woman asked me to help her get prepared because she was her grandmother's substitute decision maker. And she really wanted to do this well. She just loved her grandmother. And so she asked me, how should she do this? So her grandmother at the time was an 80-year-old woman who had worsening chronic disease. And her granddaughter was really felt that she wanted to get this right. Now, she had been in hospital, her grandmother had been in hospital several times, and every time different physicians, other care providers had asked her many times what she would want in case she became sicker. And her doctors were asking her, would you want resuscitation if your heart stopped? Would you want to be on a breathing machine? Would you want to have intravenous, etc.? They were asking her every time, these treatment decisions, because they really wanted to do the right thing for this woman based on her values and what she wanted. But her grandmother would every time say, well, I want whatever I need, or I want whatever makes me feel better, or whatever the doctors think is best. Her grandmother, as many of us, couldn't talk about the medical decisions in medical talk, because that's not actually how we make decisions. We think about what our life will be like if we do something. We think about what the outcome will be. We think about what matters to us, what we want to be able to do with our life. And so I suggested to her daughter that she sit down, or the granddaughter, that she sit down with her grandmother and ask her questions about her life, ask her questions about what's important to her. What does she see in her future, and how does she want to live in the future? Where does she want to be cared for? Is it important for her to be at home? What does it feel like when she's in the hospital? Does she feel like that's that she's maintaining her dignity? Is that important to her? So then I never saw her again, but I got an email several weeks later from the granddaughter saying, I found your suggestions about what types of questions to ask especially helpful. They simplified the conversation with my grandmother. She wrote, "It helped everyone in our family get on the same page and have a conversation that has been difficult to have." Actually, what resulted was a tear and laughter-filled cathartic evening of conversations between my grandmother and family. I really didn't think it was going to be possible for all of us to speak about it in this way. So I think what happens is we present treatment decisions to people, and that is not the way that most people make decisions. And as physicians, we do this because we have a picture in our head of all the things that will happen once we do one particular treatment, but that's not what is in everybody else's head. So that's why I think that this is a helpful approach. It makes you more what I like to call decisionally ready. You don't need to make decisions now. Your loved ones don't need to make decisions now. But as the substitute decision maker, you have an understanding of how they think about their life that will help you at the time of needing to make a decision. Now, we've just, told you all these things about it not being about treatments. But there are some treatments that actually happen in medicine that can happen very suddenly. And there isn't a lot of time or very much time at all to sort of have a conversation at the moment. And so there are some kinds of conversations or treatments that people may want to have some information about in advance. And oftentimes people say, well, what does it mean to have CPR? That kind of thing. And so I thought it would be helpful to just walk us through some of those concepts. The things that generally people hear about in the emergency department, or if they're quite sick in a hospital, are things called code status. I don't know if people have heard of these, or resuscitation status. Some people call it DNR, do not resuscitate, or do not intubate. These are all phrases that get tossed around, and they refer to somebody's already stated wishes or current wishes about having treatments done in a very specific clinical context. And that is specifically when you have your heart or your lungs stop working. What CPR means is it's a set of procedures, it's a technique that was developed really for people who have a cardiac arrest, or their heart stops due to a specific heart problem, like a heart attack or a abnormal heart rhythm. And the main problem is that they've had something with their heart. And it's a way to continue circulation until that problem with the heart, whether it's like an abnormal rhythm or a blood clot, can be fixed, and then the rest of the body can recover. What it entails is, you've all seen this on TV if you haven't seen it in real life, somebody pushing on a chest quite hard, breathing for the person either through a mask or mouth to mouth. And then in the hospital or with paramedics, putting a tube, or in the emergency room, putting a tube down your throat into the top of your lungs and attaching that to a machine that pushes air in and out. As well, there may be an electric shock delivered to get the heart beating again. If that's successful, in other words, if there's restored circulation, you would then end up in an intensive care unit. And that then, of course, you're in an incredibly high risk of other bad things happening at that point. But the general outcome is that you'd be on a breathing machine in the intensive care unit. But why, I want to review this kind of quickly, but why is it that we ask people? Like, it seems obvious if something like that happens that we would want to be resuscitated. I mean, it seems, I think that when people get asked this question, no, people don't understand why would we even ask why you wouldn't want to try to restart your heart. And the fact is because, and what a lot of people don't know, it really isn't anything like we see on TV. And the reason is that in most populations, in most cases, the success rate of CPR is extremely low. And if it is successful, as clinicians worry about actually causing more harm. And the reason is that after time without oxygen to the brain, even if there's a successful restarting of somebody's heart, you may end up in a state that you would never have wanted to happen. And when people have serious illnesses, such as very advanced cancer or lung disease or liver disease or end-stage kidney disease, when your heart stops, it's actually a multiple reason that the heart stopped. And so simply being able to restart the heart usually results in either the heart stopping again very soon, or being left in a very debilitated condition. And some people will be completely fine with that. It's just important that they know what the consequences are. And I've put up a link here. I don't think we will go through it today, but there's a link here. I don't know if it'll work if I do that. I'm probably going to regret this. Jeff, can you tell me if you can see the speak up link?
No, we can't, Leah. So
that's what I thought. Okay, we'll just carry on. There's a link that goes through decision making around CPR and other techniques like that. And it looks at what the success is in terms of actually getting discharged from the hospital and resuming your previous life. So I think that's useful for people to look at. So the reason that we ask is that unfortunately CPR is sort of one treatment we can't discuss at the time if you need it. We can't wait to speak to your substitute decision maker. And so if you're in hospital, generally the default is to go ahead and start CPR. And we want to respect the fact that many people would choose to forgo these attempts if the most likely outcome is either death or very severe disability. And that's why we ask. And the reason I wanted to bring it up today is that we often don't explain it well enough. It's a busy emergency room. Everybody's scared and worried and stressed. And so I'd like to be able to take a time when there's not a stressful moment to be able to explain that this is what people are really talking about. Because sometimes I think in the rush of an emergency room, it can sound like we actually just don't want to try, but these are the reasons that this is really what people are talking about. And I just wanted to give you guys kind of a highlight view of that. Palliative care. So let's clarify a couple of other concepts out there. Palliative care is an approach to care that aims at improving patients' quality of life, as well as the quality of life of their families. And it's applicable to any patient facing a life-threatening illness. What we do in palliative care is we work to prevent and relieve suffering. That can mean treating pain and other problems. It can mean psychosocial or spiritual pain. It aims to improve quality of life. It can be provided while still getting treatments to prolong life. So when palliative care began to become something really recognized in medical care, at the beginning, it seemed to be that you would use all the treatments that you needed to get to prolong your life as much as possible. And only when those completely stopped working would you then have access to getting palliative care, or it would be appropriate to get palliative care. But in fact, what we know now is that people benefit from the care that a palliative care provider can give. They benefit it for much longer than just at the very end of life. With good symptom management and counseling and support, people can actually do even better through the treatment of their underlying illness. Palliative care, we know, does not hasten death. It can be provided for patients with any life-threatening illness, such as congestive heart failure, lung disease, cancer, kidney disease, dementia. Now, there's palliative care provided in hospitals, but also there are organizations and institutions that focus their care around palliative care. And so it can be a little bit confusing for the lay public, all the different terms and terminology. So we have institutions that are called hospices and palliative care units. And some hospices are actually community support groups who may have specialized volunteers or staff that can visit patients in their home. For an example, Hospice Toronto. That isn't a physical place where patients go. That's an organization that supports hundreds of patients who are at home. Some hospices and palliative care units, though, are actual physical spaces, either in a hospital or in a freestanding unit, where patients can be admitted to and are cared for. And in palliative care units and hospices, generally, they're cared for with a focus on symptom relief and on attention to suffering for them and their family. These units will actually have more stringent criteria for admission than, for example, seeing a palliative care clinician in a hospital if you're there for some other reason. But we can address any of those specific questions if we need. So just to summarize, we've covered a lot today. We've had a walk through what we mean by advanced care planning. We've talked about different treatments for people who have a cardiac or respiratory arrest. And we're going to ask questions. We're going to, have time for lots of questions. But first, let's go back to the beginning when I asked you to be calm and take a leap of faith with me. And remember these people that have shared so much of their experience of end-of-life care or preparing for the end. And remember that the leap of faith is that when you think about advanced care planning, the thing is that you end up thinking about how you want to live your life, much more so than what you want at the end. And that's always a good thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you for a very informative presentation, Dr. Steinberg and Dr. Myers.